I'm thrilled to be talking to Terri Givens today. And after you hear from her directly, you'll know why. But first, I want to start by telling you a little bit about her. Terri Givens is the founder of Brighter Professional Development, Brighter High Ed. As the author of the book, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides, she is a sought-after consultant and speaker on issues related to anti-racism. She has more than 30 years of experience in higher education, politics, international affairs, and nonprofits. She is an accomplished speaker and uses her platform to develop leaders with an understanding of the importance of diversity, encouraging personal growth through empathy. Terri has held leadership positions as Vice Provost at the University of Texas at Austin and Provost of Menlo College. And she was the first African American and woman to hold that position. She's also had professorships at the University of Texas of Austin and University of Washington. She was the founding director at the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas and led the university's efforts in Mexico and Latin America as Vice Provost for International Activities, as well as curriculum development with the undergraduate curriculum portfolio. Now we're thrilled to welcome her at McGill University as a professor, and she is also conducting research on comparative politics in Europe, and she was also appointed the Provost Academic Lead and Advisor on Anti-Black Racism. Hi, Terri Givens. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So my first question, so curious, is what led you to McGill?
Well, a year ago, I was talking to a friend, Deb Thompson, who's also a professor at McGill, and I had already been thinking about, getting back into academia. I was interested particularly in getting back into teaching, and so I'd been reaching out to a few friends about some possibilities, and I learned about the McGill strategy to address anti-Black racism. And I was like, wow, this is such an amazing strategy. I've never seen one that just so directly deals with the issue of, the low numbers of Black faculty and trying to create a more welcoming environments for Black students and Black staff. So I was really excited about that. But actually, the initial interest was just to be a professor of political science again and to get back into the classroom.
I was reading about the company that you started, and after you left Menlo College, you started a consulting business in higher education. How did that start, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've been, in various positions in higher education, and, I've often played a leadership role. And I was realizing that there's not enough support for leaders in higher ed. And so initially I started off doing consulting with some folks who wanted to go into leadership positions or, were already in leadership positions and needed some, understanding of how to be a manager, how to, do human resources, in higher ed, how to deal with accreditation, all those things. So it started off that way. But then when I wrote the book, Radical Empathy, actually about 6 months before it was published, I just put a note out on LinkedIn that I was interested in maybe doing workshops, and I got a call from the UC office, University of California Office of the President, a colleague there, and she said, "Oh, would you please come and do a workshop with us?" I'm like, "Great!" So I kind of on the fly put together this workshop a couple of years ago, and it's gone. It's grown from there. So we've done a lot of different workshops, everything from working with the political science department to help them create a better sense of belonging and being, working on bringing in more Black faculty. And so, that was great prep work for, taking this job at McGill. And then, I've worked with some corporations. And so what we've been able to do is to develop this workshop that is based on the book, but also, is customized to the group of people, whoever I'm working with.
Oh, wonderful. So you have the same, so it's the Radical Empathy, but that you customize it according to your clients based on their needs. So that's amazing.
Exactly.
So that's what you'll be doing at McGill School of Continuing Studies?
When I took the job at McGill, I was, I actually met the Dean of Continuing Education, and we talked about the idea of creating a workshop. And so I started working with her staff to build this workshop and really to make it customized to the Canadian context, and to have something that would be useful for, whether you're, somebody who's already working in EDI, or somebody who is looking to get into it, or just somebody who's interested in helping to create a better workplace that's more welcoming. This is a perfect workshop for anybody who wants to understand. And so it really requires people to take responsibility and talk about what is it that is about their life story that has been impacted by broader structural discrimination. So we've all been impacted by it. And actually my book, The Roots of Racism, covers the history going back to the 1500s. And, I have various chapters that look at different aspects of structural discrimination, how it came about, how we are all impacted by it. And so the two books are very complementary for those who want to understand the history of it, and then those who want to know, how do I take action? And so it's really important that people understand that this workshop is not about sitting down and hearing about unconscious bias. It's not yet another unconscious bias training. It's really designed to help people understand, what do I have to do to create change? And so that's really an important component of it.
What has been the reaction to this workshop so far in the areas where you've already given it? Were you surprised by maybe some of the things that have come out of it?
Absolutely. Even at McGill, my time at McGill this last fall started off with doing a workshop for the leadership team, and the provost sent around a really nice note saying how impactful it was, and I just heard just amazing commentary afterwards that it really had an impact. And that's what I've heard from most of the people who've gone through the workshop, is that it's very impactful. And another difference that I didn't get to previously is that it's not blame. A lot of times people sit in these workshops and they just feel like they're under attack, and that's not what this is about. It's really about creating what I call a brave and safe space. We have to allow people to be able to say something and not worry that they're going to get jumped on, or to have that confidence that they can speak up. And yes, you might get corrected, but it's okay. We all make mistakes. And so it's really important that people understand, we got to get away from the blame game and say we're all responsible. So I had to understand for me, part of writing this book was all about understanding my own unconscious bias, and then saying, what do I have to do to have more empathy and be open to the experiences of others? And I'm getting into the 6 steps of radical empathy. And so the first step, which I model and so I encourage people to read the book if they can before the workshop, because it's really helpful to come in understanding, because I model being vulnerable. So the first step of radical empathy is this willingness to be vulnerable. And the reason that's important is because if we don't understand our own story, and the book and this workshop is a lot about storytelling, and anybody will tell you that if you want to have empathy for somebody, storytelling is really important. So I started off telling my own story, and then, actually, I show how it's hard, but I am vulnerable. I talk about things that make me uncomfortable, but we have to get to that space of being uncomfortable and being vulnerable, so that we can get to the next steps, which the next step is becoming grounded in who you are, because it's so important to understand how, if you can't love yourself, you can't love somebody else. I talk about the Whitney Houston song, the greatest love of all is learning to love yourself. That's one of my favorite songs. But, that willingness to look inside and understand who you are, is so important, and to, be accepting and give yourself empathy. So self-empathy is a very important component of this. And then that leads to the next step, which is being open to the experiences of others. So I always say that, and I have a chapter on love and marriage where I talk about, I really believe you can't love somebody else unless you love yourself first. So then that opens you up to the experiences of others, and being willing to accept people for who they are, and being, and then getting to the next step, which is practicing empathy. And the reason I say practicing empathy is because it's so important that we understand it's not, okay, I learned about empathy, I'm done. It's, here I am, somebody who's done a ton of research and all these workshops, and yet I still have to practice empathy every single day. because especially right now in the era of COVID, when we are in this situation, I mean, I'm frazzled, we're all frazzled. And, I, have to be aware that I'm probably, snapping at people, and people are going to snap at me because, but if I have empathy and practice empathy, I can say, oh, look, that person is just as frazzled as I am. I really need to be able to, give that person some grace and say, I understand. So then the next step is beyond practicing empathy is taking action. And that's the radical part of radical empathy, because taking action, you can have all the empathy in the world, and if you don't take action, and that can be, it's not about going out and marching, it's about the day-to-day stuff. Can you try to understand why a colleague is having a hard time and not getting ahead? And when it's not so cold, take a walk through your neighborhood and look, why does your neighborhood look the way it does? Who lives there? And what have been the historical issues that have kept people from maybe living in one neighborhood versus another? And then after you take action, you also have to create change and build trust. And that's a really important component. And so, and like I said, I am, I'm not perfect. I don't have any special skill in this, except that I've done a lot of research, and I've really tried to put into practice what I do. And, I've been studying these issues for a long time. So it's something that I really wanted to take out to the world in a way that is accessible and will help people to actually create change.
And which of the 6 steps do you feel meets the most resistance?
The first one.
Yeah, okay, being vulnerable.
Yes, it's so funny. I was watching, so I'm a big fan of Brene Brown, and she has several books on this. And I was watching one of her talks the other day on vulnerability, and she said, I had all this, she did her TED talk, and it got all these millions of views. And so she had some Fortune 500 companies reaching out to her, and they were like, well, we loved your talk, but we don't do the vulnerability thing. It's just like, oh my gosh, but that's so important. And I try to model that as a leader myself, is that willingness to be vulnerable. And it's really hard for people, because people see vulnerability as weakness. It's not. Actually, vulnerability is what gives us strength. And so I really try to we work on that in the workshop quite a bit.
That's wonderful, because especially in a work context, right, we were certainly not trained to be vulnerable. In fact, as you say, it is often seen as a weakness, and it's something that people
avoid
at all costs. Absolutely. So that's great. And I want to go back to something you talked about, empathy. And I loved when you said, it's more about walking in somebody's shoes. It's to know what they need, because even if we walk in somebody else's shoes, we'll do it from our own perspective, right? And
that's right.
So how do you know what somebody else needs? How do you, because I think that's a sticking point for, if we look at things like, I'm going to do, what would I want in that situation? That doesn't help address the real problem, right? So how do we know what other people need in this context?
Well, there's 2 pieces to that. First of all, you have to have some humility and understand that you may not know what that person needs. And the second is to be curious and to ask questions. And that's a tough one, because, a lot of times the questions you come up with might be, maybe even offensive, to the person, but you have to, if you come at it from a perspective of humility and to say, look, I really want to have empathy for you. I'm trying to understand what your life is like. But I also know that, I might not ask the right questions. So I hope you'll give me the grace to do that. And, just say it's coming from a place of goodwill. And so if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you a few questions so that I can do a better job of addressing what your needs are. So it's okay to ask those questions, but, take the, and if somebody is, you can see somebody's uncomfortable, say, oh, I can see you are uncomfortable in me asking that question. I'm sorry, I'm just, trying to be curious and understand more about you.
I want to go back to the word empathy, because you started by saying, people know what empathy means, but I just want to make sure, because not everybody knows the difference between empathy and sympathy. So can you maybe talk about the difference between sympathy, empathy, and then radical empathy, which is the name of your workshop, of course?
Right. So sympathy is when you see something bad happens to somebody and it's like, oh, I'm sorry. I sympathize with you. I feel bad for you. But there's no attempt to understand how what happened has impacted that person. So empathy is when you take the next step and say, gee, if I were that person, how would I feel if that happened to me? And see, the reason you need empathy is because the big problem is people say, well, racism isn't an issue anymore. It's like, have you thought about how these things impact me? Have you looked at it from my perspective? And not only looked at it from my perspective, but said, hey, is there something I can do so that you don't feel so, that you aren't experiencing these things? And a lot of it revolves around education, right? Because so many people, and this is the problem. People, they saw that the United States had a Black president and they think, okay, racism is over. But of course, then when Trump came in, it was clear that those issues were still there. But on the other hand, a lot of people feel like, why do we have to, I can't tell you how many times I've heard, why do we have to keep talking about race? Because it's still out there. It's still an issue. You have this, you can't have 500 years of history and have something disappear like that. And it takes, the reason I focus on us as individuals is, okay, we've addressed the structural issues by changing the laws, but the problem is in the implementation. So the police know they shouldn't shoot Black people, but they still do because they have these biases that tell them this person is a threat. And so we have to go and say, no, you have to look at why you believe that and understand how the structural discrimination has impacted you, and so that you can go forward and not see every Black person as a threat.
Absolutely. And it's funny, you talk about the transition from Obama to Trump and how that's, changed the American politics, but you say that you took this workshop and you put it in a Canadian context.
That's
so
right.
Can you tell us about some of the particularities of the Canadian context?
Well, obviously the situation with Indigenous peoples, and not that we don't have that issue in the United States. Actually, it's, we need to definitely have a reckoning in the United States about that as well. But, the difference with Canada is, the history is a bit different. There's a lot of similarities in the history, even though we try to pretend it's different. But, especially, before we became, our own nation states, a lot of the history is the same. And so we have to understand that aspect of it. But when you're looking at who is impacted by racism, you have to understand that people are coming from, so for example, a lot of the people, you have people from Africa, you have people from the Caribbean, you have Indigenous, you have so many different people who are dealing with these issues. But radical empathy is fine with that, because it's not just about race. It's just about how we deal with bias. It's about how we treat people. It's about creating a welcoming and belonging space. So, the main difference is, when I, like in the book, most of the examples are from the United States. So when I talk to a Canadian audience, I take examples from the Canadian history, some of the areas where there's overlap, but also, what are the issues that we're dealing with today in Canada?
And for all of you to know, the workshop is two sessions of 3 hours each, and you'll get into the 6 steps. And what do you think at the end of the 6 hours, how are people changed? And I know that's a big word, but what would you say happens to participants after the 6 hours in this workshop?
Well, hopefully they've had an experience where they've felt like they've been in this brave and safe space, that they can talk about how that's the whole point is it's a very interactive workshop. It's not a workshop where you can sit back and just watch what's happening. And we will have several exercises where I expect people to speak up and be engaged and involved and to respond to the other participants. I expect that people will come out of it, thinking about trying to figure out what can I do. And actually, I will want them to leave with action items. That's the most important thing, is that they do leave with action items. Here's a list of things that I am going to do in order to create change. And so the first step is understanding that we need change. And so hopefully they are coming in with an open mind as far as that's concerned. But it's very individual what change they need to see. This is not just for people who haven't experienced racism. It's for people who it's for women who experience sexism. It's for the white male who's got ADHD and people don't understand him. And so it's for anybody, really.